Alright, take two. The BR list has been updated. There's been a couple of changes to proposed BRs, a couple of them have been removed, and a whole mess of new ones have been added. This is easily the longest BR list that I've seen done in a single patch up to now. They've also added a bit of an explanation for why they originally wanted a few of the changes. This does offer us a bit of insight into a few of the new ones as well, whether I agree with it or not. Now, as with the previous list, I'll go over my thoughts on them. I'm going to group them into good, neutral and bad, as well as a few at the end that I'm a bit more unsure on for now, and I think are probably going to be quite controversial. Now, I'd like to keep this as short as I can, however unlikely that may be, so we'll be going through them quite briefly whenever I can. There's also a few that haven't changed at all, so we're going to put those in now onto the chart, and we're going to skip straight over them. If you want to hear my thoughts on those, please check out the previous video. So moving on now, let's talk about the things that have been removed from the list. The T-44-100 will no longer be going to 6.7. Now I thought this was a good change, so I'm a bit sad to see this one go. The M48A2C will also no longer be moving to 6.7, but this was the most controversial change on the list and received a lot of feedback on the forums, a lot of feedback on the forums. Its reason for dropping was the same as the T-44-100s, that simply it's got low statistics, but they went into a lot more detail on this one, and I think we can see a lot of the side effects of that change not going through further into this list. The ISU-122S has also been removed, there's no mention on this one. Again, I thought it was a good change, though seeing it just disappear is a bit of a shame. And finally, the T-80B change has also been dropped. There has been a few knock-on effects on the loss of this one as well. Now on to the good changes. I said last time that in its current state I thought the EBR belonged at 5.3, and this is happening. I'd still ideally like to see it fixed and moved higher, but I think 5.3 is good for now. It's definitely a positive change, and nice to see them listening to the overwhelming feedback on this one. KB85 on the previous list was corrected actually after a couple of hours. It originally said it was going to 5.0 where it already sits. It will now be moving to 4.7. I see this as a good change. It's the weakest armour of all the KVs while having the best gun. Against a 3.7 it won't really do anything that existing KVs don't already do to them, but it will actually be slightly easier to take down, funnily enough. It doesn't break the game, but it does make the vehicle itself a bit more enjoyable, so this is good. The Radpanzer 90 moving up to 9.3. If you frequent my channel, you'll know I don't really enjoy top tier, so I can't give too much thought on this one, but it does seem a bit strong at 9.0, and everyone I know is fairly unanimous in that. It's got a great shell selection, it's reliant on mobility rather than armour, so a 9.3 move provides a little bit of respite for the vehicles below it without really weakening the Radpanzer itself. The French SA-50 is moving to 5.0. This is long overdue in my opinion. Weirdly, it's going without the premium FL10 joining it. The EBR is also moving up, so I kind of feel like the whole lineup would go, but nope. I think 5.0 is the right spot for the SA-50 though. It won't quite lack a lineup as the FL10 does still perform just fine alongside it, but it is odd to see it being the only one. The Marder 3 moves down a notch to 2.3, and this could just as easily go in the neutral list, purely because it's not really going to change the vehicle's performance much. It's an open-tops tank destroyer at a BR with mostly rapid-firing guns and a lot of speedy opponents. Its firepower isn't really much of a benefit to it in a down tier, but it does help provide a little bit of extra punch for lower lineups when they get up-tiered now. The Crusader Mark III is going from 2.7 to 3.0, and this one's on me guys, sorry. Killed too many tigers and panthers with it recently, you know, it had to go up. Honestly, this is in the good changes because I think it just matches other 3.0s a bit better. It's a bit more comparable, feels like it belongs there. However, it could just as easily go into neutral because it doesn't exactly change anything. In fact, the only real change it brings is that if you try to bring a Matilda, you no longer have the backup option of something with a more powerful gun should you get up-tiered. In terms of its opponents, it barely changes a thing. The ones it meets at the moment, it doesn't overly punish, and none of them struggle to pen it back, so it's almost entirely inconsequential, but I'm putting it in good because it just feels more evenly matched to 3.0s. Finally, in the good ones, we have the StuG 3F going to 3.3. This is almost entirely in the good list because it means it's no longer a higher BR than the Panzer IV F2. I'd rather see it go the other way around and have the F2 come up to match, but it's always struck me as bizarre that despite having the same armour and same gun, the turreted version was somehow lower. Next up, we have our neutral list, and this has grown considerably. There are changes that mostly will make a little difference, or a sort of we'll have to wait and see list, I guess. First up is the Sturer Emil, previously dropping to 4.3, it's now going to 4.7. This still edges towards the bad side for me. I still see no need to have that gun at such a low BR, especially as I don't think it's really going to improve the performance of the vehicle, but it's better than the previous intention. It's still not going to become anything more useful than it already is. The Swingfire drops to 7.3. I don't really see this making any difference at all to the game, to either itself or to the things around it. It does expose a few new 6.3s to encountering it, but it's going to make such a little difference to the vehicle's overall performance that I really don't expect you'll start seeing any more of them than you already do. Or rather don't. It's just not a popular vehicle, no one's going to drive it, this isn't going to change a thing. The ZTZ-99 drops to 10.3. Again, not a top tier player, but this is essentially a weaker T-series if I'm right. Far from comparable with any other nation's top tiers, so this is pretty logical. It's in the neutral column right now because I don't feel it will actually change anything for it. It's not going to punish anything in a down tier really, but it's also not really going to affect its own matchmaking enough to suddenly make it good. The ASRAD moves up a step. This is mostly inconsequential to me. It's an AA. Mostly what it does is restrict its lineup options, so I don't really think there's much to say on this one. SU-57B to 2.7. This thing's had quite a journey. It started out at 4.0 and it's been spiralling downwards ever since. The vehicle is effectively a ZIS-30 that loses the danger of machine guns and instead gains just enough armour to make it trigger explosive rounds. So it'll basically be balanced anywhere the ZIS-30 is. I see this making absolutely no difference to any of the low tier gameplay at all, and you probably still won't ever see one. The Object 268 drops to 7.0, and I don't think this is going to affect it very much. There's a few 6.0s that are going to be slightly terrified to meet this. It's still a casemate tank destroyer. If they can handle the Jagdtiger at 6.7, this probably won't really be much of a problem. It may end up being a bad change if the game is suddenly played with them, which is often a side effect of BR changes. Even if it doesn't actually alter the usability of a vehicle, it makes people give them another go. Suddenly discover that it's perfectly fine after all. And this happened with the KV-1B when that dropped to 4.0 a few years ago, and I think it's going to happen here too. The Batchat Char 25 ton is moving up to 7.0. Very strong vehicle, it will do just fine at 7.0. But it's not really like it's terrorizing 6.7 either, and it'll generally perform well anywhere it goes. Only thing a move like this affects is lineups, and there's a lineup at either BR, so it's pretty inconsequential. AML 90 follows that to 7.0. Feelings again pretty similar really, although it does intrigue me that this one moves up while the RU251 and IKV both stay at 6.7. There are other factors involved of course besides comparable role on the battlefield, but it is interesting to see only the one change. The TAM2C is moving to 9.7. Again, not a top tier player, this isn't really something I can comment on too much. It effectively saves a few 8.3 vehicles from having to meet it, which is good, but there's plenty of other vehicles in that region which are still going to do the same job as it, so it feels a bit inconsequential other than shifting a lineup around. T25 moving to 6.3 I think is fine. Not necessary, but it's also not really going to hurt America much either. It's effectively a side grade to the Pershing. It trades armor for mobility, a smaller profile, and a stabilizer. Most people already drive them paired together, and it performs just fine. ZSU-57-2, the once scourge of Tier 5, the destroyer of worlds, is coming down to 7.3. I would be utterly terrified of this, but the lower it goes, the more armor it actually encounters. Kind of nerf in a way. BRs are a funny thing like that. It happens to a lot of vehicles, and I'll touch on that a bit more later on. But ultimately this could go either way. I'm calling it neutral for now. I feel like it's actually a nerf. We'll see. And finally, the Pz.Kpfw.Churchill goes to 4.3. This is where the controversy begins in this list, I think. In the previous video, I mentioned this one specifically as an example of vehicles needing different battle ratings despite being identical. And I stand by that claim. It's also part of the reason that Gaijin mentioned for wanting to change the M48. This edges towards a good change for me, as it breaks with that German 4.0 premium lineup that continues to dominate the entire tier. But I'm calling it neutral for now because it's not really the main problem there, and it's a change I'm going to have to see play out a bit first. But why the controversy? Well, because now we move on to the bad changes, and first up we have the British Churchill Mark III. This is an identical vehicle to the Pz.Kpfw in every way except for the tree it's in, and they're both moving to 4.3. As I just said, I do think these deserve different BRs. The German guns make short work of the British Churchill's armour, to the extent that, I personally have almost 3 times the kill rate in my German one compared to my British one. It's not the only reason I'm calling this change bad. It does disrupt the British lineup quite considerably. I know my opinion here might be a bit controversial. Honestly, I'd rather see neither move than both go up. The T-54 1949 is coming down to 7.3. This is basically the worst T-54, but I still think this is a bad change. This brings a T-54 into fighting things like Pershings or the newly moved T-25 and Hori prototype. Never mind anything that they might bring as a backup vehicle once they've died. This is going to be too strong in my mind. The T-54 itself will probably perform a tiny bit better, so statistically it'll look like, oh, we fixed the problem, yes. But the knock-on effects to other vehicles that now have to fight it is going to be rough, and I feel like in a few months we're going to see a bunch of those vehicles getting lowered down because they're now performing badly, and it's just going to increase compression. The T-80U and the T-72B3 both come down to 10.3. This is a direct reaction to the feedback about the T-80B. Gaijin felt the T-80B was performing too poorly in their stats and wanted to lower it to 9.7. Community disagreed, but they're determined to fix the problem, so their new solution is to lower other vehicles down to give it a stronger lineup. I don't think this is a good idea. While they're not equal to the Leopard 2A5 and 2A6 certainly, I still think this is the wrong way to go about it. I'd rather see the Leopards raised to 11.0, or frankly I'd rather see the entire tree stretched to 12.0 and spread a few other things out as well, but that's just not going to happen right now. It's an interesting one though, as the previous change would have suggested that the B was so much worse than the U that it needed an entire BR gap. And now they're going to be almost the same instead. This is entirely dependent on how you interpret battle ratings. Again though, I'm not a top tier player, so take this with a grain of salt. The SU-122 is moving to 2.3. This is another case of a vehicle that just doesn't really fit the meta. It's something with a long reload and chemical-only ammo, and it's just been consistently lowered to try and boost its stats. And now we're in the territory where it's just going to become too difficult to kill for a new player. How much further will it go? If it keeps doing badly, we're going to end up with it fighting reserves? Please, no. The IKV-103 is moving to 5.0. This is another of those changes I don't really think is going to affect the vehicle itself, but it will really hurt anything lower than it. It can be penned by anything, and it can pen anything. Its win rate, if it changes, will only change because it's now being paired with different vehicles around it. The vehicles around it dictate its win rate more than it does itself. It will basically perform the same at 7.0 as it will at 5.0, and anything in between. It's just that type of tank. It'll be very unfun for someone driving out a 4.0 to suddenly receive that heat shell through their front plate. The IS-3 goes to 7.0. A lot of people have wanted this for a very long time, and it's probable this is less about the IS-3 itself and more a side effect to the T-44 change being withdrawn. They're basically trying to give it a lineup and allow the 44 to be played at 7.0 instead of at 7.3, and that applies to the Object 268 as well. I really dislike this change. especially when you combine it with other changes in this list. If you look at it now, a Panther G or the now 6.0 T20 in Centurion Mark 1 are suddenly expected to fight an IS-3. Not to mention everything in between just went from seeing an IS-3 in only a full up tier to seeing it a lot more often, especially with the knowledge that a BR drop usually means the vehicle gets driven more in general from people trying to check it out. I really fear for the vehicles at lower BRs having to run into this. Comet is moving to 5.7 to take the Centurion 1 slot, and this is another move I'm against. Win rates might be high, I don't know, I don't have their statistics. But this is now higher than the Panther D. It's the same BR as the Panther A and F. I know which vehicle I'd rather drive if I got the choice. If it's really, really overperforming at 5.3, you can maybe go the other way, remove its APDS, possibly drop it down to 5.0, who knows. There are other solutions, and I'm worried what this means. The Churchill Mark 1 is moving up to 3.3. This is now bringing the wonderful fun of trying to throw a slow-moving 2-pounder against much bigger targets. Yeah. And finally on the bad list is the Leopard 1 coming down to 7.3. I think I've basically covered the reasons I think this is bad in some of the other changes already. I don't really want to be trying to deal with Leopards in something like a Super Pershing or the T25. This is essentially a reaction to the withdrawal of the M48, I think. By bringing it down, they're trying to boost the M48's win rate, giving it a stronger lineup and increasing the chance of it being on the M48's team. It might end up alright, but I really fear for tier 4s getting up tiered against it. That leaves only a few changes left to discuss. It's the Centurions moving to 7.3. I really don't know where to put these. My gut reaction says it's bad. I know a lot of people who feel the same way. But I also know some who are arguing that it's a positive change with every breath they can manage. The Centurions, well, they're a bit awkward really. They're one of those sets of vehicles that actually performed worse at a lower battle rating. Similar to the ZSU, as I mentioned before, sometimes lowering a battle rating can actually be a nerf, or raising it can actually be a buff. I have some theories as to why. Primary among them for me is that most of the things below them are firing explosive rounds. So they're far more likely to get one shot. Things higher than them, less so. There's other aspects again to this, to any statistic in the game. There's simply too many factors involved between the things. You have, what vehicles can back it up in the lineup? What maps does it work well on? Which other nations are you paired with, and what vehicles can they bring? What's the presence of CAS? Things like that. So many things affect statistics. At 6.7, the bulk of the team, I think, was usually going to be Americans, or a few up-tiered Soviets from 6.3. That didn't really weaken the Centurions themselves, but it did weaken the team as a whole, resulting in an easier time for their opponents to fight them. At 7.0, things change a bit. The other nations don't have such a large lineup to bring in, but it also leaves 6.7 a lot more empty, meaning that anything at 6.7, like the Tiger 2s, are now getting up-tiered more often. Best metric we have statistically as a player is Thunder Skill, which isn't ideal, but basically going off that, after moving the Centurions to 7.0, the German 6.7 win rate actually went down by almost 20%, and this lineup gained roughly about the same amount. So moving the opposition up actually made it worse for German tier 4. I think we could debate over this a lot. There's a lot of arguments to be made for any side of it. What we can almost certainly say though is that this is a reaction to the M48 change being withdrawn again. These vehicles were specifically mentioned as being the main opponents that it has to fight. And if they can't move the M48 down, they're going to move everything around it up. The problem with that alternative is the BRs are still far too compressed. I mean, now, who's going to enjoy trying to fight a T55 AM with a Centurion Mark III when you get up tiered? And the final thing for this change for me is, if we have a look at the British tree as a whole now, it's getting into an interesting issue. If you don't count premiums, at 4.7 you now have 3 tanks. 5.0 there's none. 5.3, 1. 5.7, 1, 6.0, 1, 6.3, 1, 6.7 there's 2, 7.0 there will be 2, and 7.3 there will be 2. Now the 6.7s and one of the 7.0s are incredibly mediocre tank destroyers that nobody ever bothers to drive. This basically means that the British fleet isn't going to lack for vehicles. You know, they've got something at every battle rating, but it will lack anything resembling a drivable lineup for almost 3 BRs. The 7.3s are almost certainly going to be used as a backup to the 7.7 lineup. There's, you know, no point missing out on things like the Conqueror and the Centurion 10 and the Vickers or the Falcon just so that you can drive your Centurion Mark III or your Caernarvon instead. There's just so many changes going on at once here. I think it's really going to upset that tree. These changes as a whole mean that now, let's say you're driving the Centurion 1 and you die a few times. You might end up having to drive a Firefly against an IS-3. The British tree in general is looking very odd. Now, some of the changes in this list done on their own are fine. I think I'd like to see fewer changes but done more often, as opposed to really big bulk changes. The other thing with the Centurion lineup moving as well is it going to get a slightly cheaper repair cost? Or is that going to be forgotten about for several months? Who knows? But that's my overall thoughts on the battle ratings right now. We've had a few hours to process them. This video has taken longer than I really would have liked to put together. But that's everything. Everything covered. I hope I haven't missed any of them. Obviously this is only tanks and this is only realistic. But let me know what you think. I know there's going to be some controversial thoughts in here. Hopefully I'm wrong and these all turn out to be great changes. But I'm very skeptical on some of these. We'll just have to wait and see. So let me know your thoughts, be it good or bad. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.